Well, welcome back. Welcome back. We are back in the shop on the Tripacer, and today is the start of probably multiple days of covering the fuselage and wrapping it up. So we're just going to get started right into the time lapse. Let's do time lapse today. All right, so we have the tail mostly taken care of. There's a couple of things I do want to point out about the tail, about why I did what I did. So let me turn the camera around and we'll talk about that for a sec. So the tail, I prefer to work from the top down. Some people prefer to work from the bottom up. I prefer to do the top down because the top on this particular model is a little bit more delicate. Specifically this piece here, which is free floating, this butts up to the vertical stabilizer when it's fully assembled. So that's why I didn't bother shrinking anything too much down here, because once I assemble the empennage area, I'm going to have to do some additional covering work down here. So that's why it's left kind of rough. It is what it is. So yeah, so I'm going to probably add a piece of covering right in here. I want to see how things look first and how much they're potentially binding. Obviously this Oratex stuff is a little bit thick, and if I need the additional clearance, then I will forego it. So again, left everything here for fitting the empennage and all of the stabilizer surfaces, so that everything's nice and clean. If you notice, I'm using the same technique where I'm working center out, working the perimeters first, holding things tight, and once I have the edges tacked down, then I heat the iron back up and reseal the edges, make sure they're nice and tight, and then do the main surfaces to take out any wrinkles. I did do these areas here, these little pieces of balsa that butt up to the flaps. I did those first because I wanted to kind of blend that in. You can see a little bit here, but honestly, when you get up and close on the full scale airplane, you can see where the fabric overlaps as well. So I'm not too concerned about that, and I made it pretty even on both sides, leaving about 1/4 of an inch, 3/8 of an inch of trim around these edges so that it looks nice and finished. All right, so from here, also I want to note that I sealed really well around my outlets for my push rods before I cut them out, and then after I did a little bit of additional stuff just to clean up the edges from trimming with the razor. Looks pretty good. And again, I'm not expecting this area here to be absolutely perfect because I need to glue on my tail. Then, you know, when you get to the bottom, you know, when you're overlapping these panels, you noticed I was just using my razor to cut along the edge. I am using very little pressure. Very little pressure. I'm basically just dragging the knife across this edge. Number one, because I want to be careful not to cut into the layer below, but you honestly don't need that much. And that way you run the knife right along the wood and it gives you a nice natural line. There's going to be a little bit of wave. There's going to get real close here. It's not exactly perfect, but frankly, neither is Patrick's airplane. I've been up and I've seen it. These things are covered by humans, and there are imperfections on the surface. So I kind of like the not perfectly crisp, looks like it came from a factory kind of look. Yeah. So now I'm going to move on to the front area, and I need to reference some documents and pictures. And remember what I need to cover. Pretty sure this area needs to be covered. Not this area, but everything else, because that's wood. Also want to note that I did use some basic primer to cover up yellow and blue. Let's come around the other side. So coming around here, I mean, notice before all of this was like blue and yellow and all sorts of nasty, but I did mark the CG, and then after I applied primer, I redid this in marker so that I know where it is. So there's a door that goes in here that is over on the table, but all of this, it just made sense to shoot it with primer while it was, you know, taken care of and out, uncovered. If you know it's worth going through and finishing this whole cockpit area, I will take off the windows and I will mask everything off to shoot blue on the interior and make sure that it's nice and pretty. But for the time being, we are just focusing on covering for now. Obviously, I'm going to try to reuse some of these holes for screwing down the window that goes here, as well as the windscreen. I think you guys get the point that, you know, it's not difficult really to do this. I mean, it may look like it's pretty easy, and that's because I've had practice. I'm not the best covering person in the world, but you know, you just take your time, one panel at a time, and do your best and be patient. Be patient. So what happens when your GoPro video dies when it says 40% battery left and then 5 minutes later it dies? You keep building. In all seriousness, guys, the battery did die unexpectedly on the GoPro, and I was able to make some additional progress. So of note, I was able to finish covering the front of the fuselage, and as you can see, I was able to sneak the iron in there and sort of get on the underside and tuck it under, so there's no real seam that's going to rip and fray here. That was important to me, so that we can make a nice clean line here to separate between fuselage and the cowl. Temporarily, or at least partially installed the mains, partially installed the front just to get it on its legs, to get one more part out of my way. But then I glued on the H-stab. It's pretty simple. I measured and made a mark here where it's dead center, and then made a string from here all the way to dead center of the tip, and marked a center line for the vertical stabilizer. And then so installing the H-stab, same procedure as always. Centered the trailing edge, obviously measuring, make sure that it's dead center. And then I measured from this point all the way up to this point. It is 66.2 centimeters, and I made sure that it was exactly the same on both sides. Used Gorilla Glue, only oozed out a tiny bit that I've since removed. Pretty minor foaming out, since I've pretty well learned how to manage Gorilla Glue over the years. And then I used the same method on the vertical stabilizer, only difference being that I used 1/64 ply little tabs, just cut into this bottom of the stabilizer as well as into the flat plate here along the center line, and just use these little 64th inch ply tabs. They're about this long, and they're recessed into the vertical stab and then plug into the horizontal stab, just giving some sort of structure for gluing, because this is not very straight. You can see that the construction here is a little bit off, and yeah, there's a gap along this trailing side. So I wanted to fill that gap with Gorilla Glue, but I wanted to make sure that there was some sort of mechanical structure, not just relying on the glue. I also added a wooden dowel into this segment here so that that's structural as well. And from there, I just went ahead and put in the rudder just to make sure that it would align okay. I'm not too worried about covering this seam right now. I can always pull the rudder off and cover that, but I'll do that after maiden flight. So we're ready to put on some more hardware from Gopro to get the control surfaces working in the tail. I have to go through here and tidy up this empennage area. It's kind of a tricky one since the full scale was pretty... So the vertical is like one piece built into the fuselage, and then the horizontal would plug into it. So all of this is covered in one big piece, and then so shaping this area is a little bit difficult here just because it's constructed very differently. Yeah, I might have to get creative. I think what I'll probably likely do, it's not the most scale solution, but probably do a single piece around just this area. I'll do some strips along the entire bottom of the V stab and H stab intersection, and then just do another piece around here that's secondary to like sort of give that reinforcement look where you would use 2 layers of covering on a full scale airplane. Sort of like where you would do an overlap on a full scale airplane. I mean, obviously there would be some sort of stitching or something there, but you can tell those kinds of seams, which I've done here as well. And then of course back up here too. So that's sort of the plan. Over here we've got the cowl, which I used my razor saw to cut. Got some offset hinges, some like door hinges, but I need to open up this gap a little bit. I glued the hinges on before, I cut this free just because I wanted to make sure the alignment was perfect. Kind of regretting that, but I can use the Dremel tool to clean that up pretty quickly. Moving on after that, I've got some bolts there. What are those for? Those are for the struts that I need to make fresh new ones for, and I'll get into that later. I'll make new struts that go, let's see, between this hole and that hole, and then there will be struts that go between that same hole on the bottom down to the bottom of the fuselage. Okay, so more on that later, but yeah, let me get the GoPro out and make sure that it's fully charged, and we'll get started building again. So, after a very productive weekend, we have something that definitely resembles a Tripacer. Alright, so let's get a rundown of what's going down here. So we definitely got our control horns installed and linkages installed for the elevator and rudder. And I was able to wrap up this part here, this area. So it doesn't match the exact body line of the full scale, so I just did the best that I could. Again, the full scale has horizontal stabilizers that plug into the fuselage, so all of this would be a little more rounded out normally, but there's really no good way to anchor it, so you know, it is what it is. So I am pretty happy with that line though. Yeah, it turned out about as good as it can get for that without having to completely redo stuff that would just not make sense for this. Moving on. Windows. Got new windows cut out for the sides. So this is new and the other side is new. Did not get a new windshield cut, mostly because the size that I have... Oh, hi, Toto. Hi, buddy. Welcome to the shop. He's really noisy, so anyway. Yeah, so the PETG that I have is only 12 by 12, and when I laid it out flat, it was not going to fit. So really what I did was, because of the new nose, I more or less used it just as a template. I had to trim the bottom here so that these sides would fit more flush. I'm probably going to go back over these once I do more of the detailing in the cockpit, and I'll go over these with some more Oratex. Anyway, yeah, so you know, fitment could be a little bit better, but I think a lot of this because of all the cracking and whatnot. So again, this is not final. I will order some new PETG to fit this properly, but there you go. What else? Oh, ta-da! We have a hatch. So previously, this piece of ply here was covered and was secured with 8 screws. Kid you not. So every time you had to put on and remove the wings, you had to undo and redo 8 screws. Forget that. So we've got 3 hinges, mostly to keep this line flush, and yeah, just did a little bit of trimming on this piece on the leading part here, but it is the exact same piece. I made sure that these balsa pieces that centered on the back part were nice and even and fit in that hole properly, and then made a magnet and a magnet, and magically I managed to put that magnet on upside down. That's why it looks kind of crummy, but totally works. And since the air is going this way, I'm not too worried about having a super strong magnet on that. Yeah, oh yeah, strut. So the other strut here, which I still have to do. So originally these struts, and again, as far as I can tell, this airplane, where is it? Right down there. 1997. Earliest date I can find on this airplane. So when these struts were originally made, very clearly you can tell that there's no primer when I started sanding back. There's no primer underneath this paint. So what has happened is the paint, because it wasn't perfect and because it's aluminum oxidizes, okay guys? And that oxidation has bubbled up all the paint. So it's a really rough surface, like right here. Can sort of see it in that light right there. Yeah, so I had to take my power sander and sand off the whole thing, and I put on a nice coat of automotive primer first, just to seal everything, and then I put a white primer as a base, and then I'm gonna paint it white with a proper enamel. So yeah, just got one more to do. Let's see what's left. There's a hatch under here, still need to do that hatch, and the door, still need to finish the door, and then I need to do these support struts for the tail. I'll cover those in the video, but everything else is pretty straightforward that I've covered on my channel before. You know, I'm just trying to button this up and get this thing flying to see if it flies, to see if it's worth doing a full detailed out job on. But right now it's looking pretty nice. Everything is nice and square. Really pleased with how this is turning out. So with that said, guys, you know, I know this has been kind of a long video, but you know, I kind of wanted to just show how things go. And you know, you get to the end of a project and there's lots of little things that you got to button up. So that's sort of what I'm trying to do. I mean, I showed you the overall covering on the fuselage, and that's really important, especially some of these small places that it's, you know, it's not really covering 101, it's not really covering 102, it's more like a 200 level course for college, just because it's a little bit more difficult dealing with compound curves and dealing with such a large airplane that, you know, one piece of covering isn't going to cover the whole panel that you need to get done. So doing it in segments makes a lot of sense. So with that, I am going to take a break and I'm going to go edit this video so that you guys can get all caught up to speed. And until next time, keep working on your flying works of art.